6 minutes. Mr. Cooper, you have the floor for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Former Liberal Minister Baines, your department had contribution agreements with SDTC. It was funding SDTC, correct?
My understanding is that we allocated funds to Sustainable Development Technology Canada.
Yes, through contribution agreements. So why did your department, under your watch, fail to conduct even a single audit to determine SDTC's compliance with the contribution agreements with your department? Why did that not happen?
The monies were allocated to this arm's length organization that made the determinations, and there are regular routine checks and balances that exist in the system, and my understanding is that those processes were followed.
Balances didn't work because 59 million taxpayer dollars went out the door in contravention of the contribution agreements with your department. Were you unaware that monies upon millions of dollars of tax dollars were going out the door improperly? Is that what you're saying? You were oblivious to that fact as minister?
To answer that question, Mr. Chair, I've been very clear that the members on the board are independent. They make these decisions independently.
Former Liberal Minister Baines, do you accept that your department had a responsibility to see that the fund used public funds appropriately?
Mr. Chair, as I was saying before I was interrupted, that this is an independent board that makes independent
I would invite you to read paragraph 6.68 of the Auditor General's report that says precisely that. We're talking about $1 billion tax dollars here that your department sent to SDTC. Your department had a duty to see that those funds were being used appropriately. Did you ask any questions to anyone about what was going on with $1 billion taxpayer dollars that your department was responsible for overseeing?
Mr. Chair, as I stated before, this independent board had clear rules on how to make decisions, on how to allocate funds, on how to engage management, and how to oversee the day-to-day operations. That is why it's an arm's length organization.
How often did you make inquiries about what was going on at SDTC? How often did you speak to your deputy minister? How often did you speak to ADM Noseworthy, who was sitting in on every one of these board meetings in which there were conflicts, in which tens of millions of dollars improperly went out the door?
Mr. Chair, again, the issues with respects to the conduct of the board members was not brought to my attention.
Well, before you went to Cabinet and requested $750 million be sent over to SDTC, did you ask for any kind of report, any sort of overview of what was going on at SDTC? An audit? Anything?
As the member knows, when monies are allocated, they're part of the budget that is debated in the House of Commons. That was all done in a very open, transparent way of where the funds would go.
Former Liberal Minister Baines, do you accept the principle of ministerial responsibility?
No, you won't answer.
I think it's important to advance the interests of Canadians to make sure that we continue to support, in this particular instance, the clean tech sector.
Former Liberal Minister Baines, it's clear that you were AWOL as minister. You didn't care, and as a result, 400 million taxpayer dollars improperly went out the door at SDTC. So will you at least accept responsibility that you didn't do proper due diligence, you didn't ask the right questions, or is it that you just didn't care and turned a blind eye?
Mr. Chair, respectfully to the member, I care very much about the clean tech sector. I've stated why it's important and why we had sustainable.
Mr. Baines, you don't care about is the taxpayer.
Just 1 second. I'll come back to Mr. Cooper. Yes.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to flag the bells are ringing. What's going on? quorum call? Okay, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
You have the time for this last question, Mr. Cooper, and not a long wind-up. So yeah, you have time for a succinct question, please.
Former Liberal Minister Baines, it's clear you don't care about conflicts of interest and you don't care about the stewardship of taxpayer dollars. And as a result, $400 million improperly went out the door under your watch as minister. And when I asked you whether you take responsibility, you couldn't even answer that. You have no shame.
En poursuivant ma ligne.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. Along the same lines as my previous questioning, Mr. Baines, when Ms. Lawrence testified, she was unequivocal on the fact that she warned Mr. Noseworthy, i.e. the ADM, of her concerns regarding Ms. Verschuren's conflicts of interest, not just once, but on 2 occasions. Does that surprise you?
Again, thank you for the question. This was new information that was something that I heard about later on, but not during my tenure as my time at ISED.
Très bien. Est-ce que vous pensez...
I see. Do you think that that kind of information, which is quite important, the CEO of an organisation who's saying, I think that it's dangerous to appoint Ms. Verschuren as chairperson of the board, is that's information that Mr. Noseworthy had knowledge of? Shouldn't that have at least been escalated to the Deputy Minister?
There's potential routes of how that could be addressed. One such a route is that the individual, in this particular case, Ms. Verschuren, for example, who we're talking about, did seek the advice and counsel of the Conflict of Interest Commissioner.
Merci, Monsieur Baines. Mon temps est limité. Vous avez déjà répondu ça.
Sorry to cut you off, but as far as the process is concerned, this is highly relevant information. Ms. Verschuren had a clear conflict of interest, and the CEO of SDTC mentioned that on several occasions. Don't you think, I'll repeat, you are the minister for over 5 years. As far as the process is concerned, isn't it the role of the ADM to inform the Deputy Minister, and also in this case, the Minister's staff, and by extension the Minister, there's a substantive conflict of interest, given that the buck stops with the Minister to appoint individuals? Did you simply blindly trust the department?
No, I would respectfully say to the member, it was the vetting process that I respected a great deal. That was led by PCO. That would make recommendations that gave me confidence that the individuals met the criteria.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Ce sera tout pour moi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's all.
Mr. Canings, you have the floor, please, for 2.5 minutes.
Okay, well, thanks. I will just continue on. I'm just trying to stick with things that are clearly your responsibility or were your responsibility, Mr. Baines. And one of those, as I mentioned before, under the Act, the Minister is responsible to ensure that board members are appointed, or at least 7 of them out of the 15, I think. And yet we had times, as I mentioned, where those numbers declined drastically, and the board, I don't know, can't imagine how the board would properly function with only 3 of those members. Just wondering what the process of appointing the board members that you were responsible for, was that something that the searches, the openings were initiated by PCO, or who put that out, or was it through your staff and then to PCO and then back to you? What was the process and why did it fail?
So thank you very much, Mr. Chair, to the member for that question. All these appointments were made public through an appointments website that's available to everyone. There could be potential gaps for a whole host of reasons in terms of delays of when an appointment is made, depending on the vetting process and the number of appointments, etc. But as I said, and as the members indicated, the responsibility of the Minister of ISED was to appoint the 7 of the 15 members, and that's what I did during my tenure, was appoint individuals. And again, these individuals have to go through that vetting process. And in some instances, that could take a bit longer than anticipated because there's so many people applying. And I think when you start a new appointments process as well, you want to make sure it's properly resourced. And so there could be some growing pains there associated with that timeline.
That's all I have.
Okay, all right, very good then, thank you. Turning now to Mr. Perkins, you have the floor for 5 minutes, and then we'll hear from Mr. Ertzen-Smith. Mr. Perkins, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Baines. You know who Leah Lawrence is?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Yes, she is the former CEO of Sustainable Development Technology Canada.
In the appointment process of Ms. Fisherin, you can't recall talking to Ms. Fisherin, although she testified before committee that you did. Do you recall talking to Ms. Leah Lawrence about it and asking her to vet the two names?
No, I do not recall having such conversations.
Do you recall any conversations with ADM Noseworthy, who sat in every board meeting, telling you and your office that the board chair, proposed board chair, Ms. Fisherin, had a conflict of interest? It's the first in the history, contrary to MP Erskine-Smith, the first in the history of SDTC to be appointed as chair of the board with a conflict of interest.
Again, Mr. Chair, as I mentioned, individuals should follow the Conflict of Interest Act. That's point one. Point two is, again, no issues were raised to my attention in terms of the conduct of the board on the day-to-day basis, because this is an arm's-length organization.
Do you recall the former head of corporate affairs for SDTC, who prior to that worked in the current Prime Minister's office? Do you recall her talking to you and your office about the conflict of interest?
Again, I don't know who you're referring to. Respectfully, as I said, these appointments were made over 5 years ago. And so specific conversations or names on lists, I don't have specific recollections.
Well,